Fantasy books come in many shapes and forms, but they're known mostly for the epics, vast, sprawling series of novels, each one thicker than Megan Thee Stallion's wagon. But what about fantasy standalones? Fantasy stories that might be just as ambitious as the epics, but contained within one lone novel. No sequels, no prequels, just this one brick of pages. Are standalone fantasy books worth your time? Can a fantasy world or plot really be fleshed out in one book alone? Just where do they stand? Let's discuss. What's shaking? My name's Cam, welcome back to another video. I do a lot of discussions on this channel about fantasy stories and books, but I want to start a new series. This is the first video in a new series I want to do on this channel, depending on how well it goes, called Should We Bother With? Basically, where rather than just having a conversation about how I feel about certain things within fantasy, I have an off-the-cuff conversation with you guys. I asked you in a community post on my YouTube channel a little while ago how you feel about standalone fantasy books, so that's what we're going to be discussing today. I enjoy standalone stories in between series as you meet the characters, go on an adventure, and it's done. Lately, everything has to be a series or a franchise, and it often feels forced and bloated. So Jenny makes a good point here, and it's a point that I think a lot of people who enjoy standalone fantasy would relate with. In particular, I think a lot of people who enjoy standalone fantasy like reading them between big epic series. Because the truth of the matter is that right now, or at least in the last, let's say, decade or so, the main structure of fantasy and publishing has been pushing for really long epic series. That's what seems to sell the most books. If a publisher can keep you invested in a series, then they know that they have at least some commitment from you and your wallet going forward. And that's not to say that the popular fantasy authors don't want to be writing these series, because when we think about fantasy, long epic series is pretty much the first thing that comes to mind. And I know for a lot of people who write fantasy, that's what they want to do. But I want to focus here on what Jenny said about reading standalone fantasy in between series, because what we seem to find is that standalone seems like a bit of a good cool down. It's a bit of a palate cleanser. Simply put, sometimes it's nice just to pick up a book, read it, and just be done. Just get the story, enjoy it, and move on. And within almost any other genre, that's something that is not just common, but something you almost come to expect. Let's say horror, for example. I would go so far as to say that it's actually quite rare for a horror to be part of a series, and sometimes it's just nice to be able to pick it up, read it, and then be able to go on to other stories. That's what I love about Choose Your Own Adventure books. It was all about decisions and consequences. It was fun and fast, plus had more readability than a normal standalone fiction book. It's actually really interesting that you bring up Choose Your Own Adventure, because not the self-plug or anything, but I've done a video specifically on that exact type of storytelling and whether that could work for fantasy. I completely agree. Choose Your Own Adventure is, I would say, a very underrated form of storytelling. It feels a lot nowadays like a gimmick or something that you would do for a satire or a comedy or a children's book. When I think of popular fantasy fiction, Choose Your Own Adventure isn't something that really comes to mind, and I'm not sure that within my reading lifespan I've ever seen a Choose Your Own Adventure fantasy on a bestseller list. It is a type of storytelling that I would love to see come back into popularity, but I also do kind of understand how it would be difficult for that to happen. Telling a story, especially like a fantasy, involves a lot of work on the author's part to get you invested in the plot and the characters, and if the author is required to make the story deviate in so many situations depending on what the reader chooses, it can be hard to build a proper character arc for those characters. But it's a super interesting question. How do you feel about Choose Your Own Adventure? I'm horrible at following through its series. If the first book wasn't amazing, I'll rarely read the rest of the series, so I'd love to see more standalones. I've read too many fantasy books that felt unfinished because it was obvious that you'd have to read book 2, 3, or more to get to the full story. Which makes sense, of course, but if the first book doesn't hook me because it lags too much, I'd rather read something new. That's also a really interesting point. When we think about a fantasy series, something we need to ask ourselves is the author relying too much on the fact that this is going to be a series for them to tell the story well? I'm sure we've all had experiences with starting a fantasy series where the first book just feels a lot like more of a prologue than an actual novel, and if that prologue is spanning over like 500 pages, That's a huge commitment on the part of the reader to not be getting as much back as we probably should be. The author might put off of doing a lot of world building or character development because they know that they can just do that in the next books. Whereas with Standalone, the author knows that they only have a certain amount of pages to do that. And so it does sometimes feel like a lot more effort is put into cutting out the fluff and making sure they're telling the story as effectively as they could be. That's the thing with series. A lot of times we get way too much fluff, especially in fantasy. The problem I sometimes have with standalone fantasy books in particular is that for some reason with fantasy, it's very difficult to make me truly care about a character over the course of one book. So if someone dies in the end, I don't really feel too bad about it. However, with something like a trilogy, it can be gut-wrenching if in that second or third book when a favorite character dies because you've been able to grow with them over time. I think Spencer's right here. Logically, that does make a lot of sense. The more time you spend reading about these characters or traveling with them through different locations and situations and conflicts, you are going to get more attached. So again, logically, if you're reading multiple books about this character or characters, you're going to be more invested than you would be in one. Now, that's not necessarily always the case. That will just come down to the author's ability to tell the story. But if we're to focus on standalone fantasy books in particular, in that one book, yeah, it's very possible that you won't be as invested as you would be if it was a series. Although I think one novel, I truly believe, is more than enough time to get a reader invested in a character or characters if you do it well. I love a good standalone when I can actually find one. As long as it manages to tell a full story and has decent characters and world building, I think they're fantastic, and a lot less daunting than a series that is going to take forever to get through. I also think they're a great way for someone to give fantasy a try for the first time, as I think a lot of people are put off by the prospect of having to read 15 books to get a proper ending. So personally, I think this is one of the best points that has been made so far. One of the biggest hurdles or obstacles for the fantasy genre, especially for new readers coming into it, is just how huge a lot of the most popular series are, the series that people are recommending to new readers or just readers in general. I mean, look at the Wheel of Time, for example. It's huge. It's so big it be clapping when they walk, you know what I'm saying? It's massive, and if you were to suggest Wheel of Time to a new reader, which a lot of people would because it is known as one of the best fantasy series ever written, I think it would be a very small percentage of people that would actually give it a go. What it comes down to is the commitment that is being asked of the reader, and I'm not saying long series are a bad thing, but especially when talking about new readers, I just don't think they're going to be as willing to give that a shot. And that's where the value of standalone fantasy books really come into it. If they know that they can try fantasy with just one book, see if they like it or not, and get a full story, I would say they're going to be much more willing to give it a go. And if they end up loving it, that could be a gateway into the whole fandom as a whole, and hey, they might end up reading Wheel of Time. So much of fantasy is based around effective world building. With a standalone, it feels like a lot of that time and effort can feel wasted, but it also leaves it open for a return to the world down the road. A lot of that's going to come down to the author's ability as a writer and how good they are at effectively telling a fantasy story in a shorter span of time. I would argue that in a lot of cases, telling a standalone fantasy book can be more difficult than telling a series, writing a series. I haven't written a standalone fantasy book before, but I imagine that one of the most difficult things that they would run into, the writers, the authors, would be knowing the balance that has to go into it. You know, weighing up character development versus plot versus world building versus, let's say they're making different fantasy races or creatures. There is a lot involved creatively when you're writing a fantasy story, and being able to balance all of that and still tell a good story in one book alone, yeah, I'd be confident saying that that could be more difficult in a lot of ways than writing a series. I think short episodic fantasy is on the rise, like light novel type stories. It's likely that readers go from longs to shorts, not only in video format, but also for the storytelling in books. So in that sense, a standalone would make sense in the future if they are built episodically. When I think of standalone fantasy books, I'm not really thinking of episodic. I would still consider them as part of a series. And as a self-published author, I'm going to take this moment to do a quick self-plug. In early February, I'm releasing the first book in my new episodic fantasy series. The series is called The Saber's Nocturne, and the first book is called Blood for Coins. This series is going to be comprised of pretty short books, around 40 to 50,000 words. A lot of people would consider that a novella, and the reason I'm writing this series is because I yearn for the days of episodic fantasy, more self-contained, shorter stories about characters having some little adventure. Lots of little adventures that can, in the long run, come together in some way, and that's what this series will be. The Saber's Noctum is about two sellswords that are as close as brothers. They grew up together, and they're quite good at what they do. They won't just slay monsters for you, they'll do pretty much anything that you don't want to get your hands dirty with. If you need someone robbed, if you need something killed, if you need a job done, these guys are your guys. And in the first book, Blood for Coins, there's one issue. One of them is in the world's most dangerous prison. That's my plug. So going back to the actual comment about episodic fantasy and standalone fantasy books, or more specifically, the rise of shorter types of storytelling, I think that's a really good point. And it's a really interesting point too, because not to sound too much like a boomer, but you know, in today's day and age with such short attention spans, when we go to things like YouTube Shorts or TikToks, or in regards to storytelling, like Kindle Vella, which we still can't use or upload to in Australia for some reason. It's been like 2 years, come on Amazon. It is an undisputable fact that shorter forms of storytelling are definitely gaining more traction and more popularity, and it's happening very quickly. The big traditional publishers haven't seemed to have caught on to this just yet, but that's how it usually happens. They usually catch on a bit late, and then it becomes a huge trend, a huge wave. So this raises a good question. In the future, it is very likely, or do you think it's likely, that we will see a lot more standalone fantasy books or episodic fantasy books? Is it possible that the long epic fantasy series might become a lot less popular? Sometimes standalones serve as a great stop point between series or even books within a series. Good enough standalones tend to be hard to find though, especially when compared to the world building or emotional attachment you build up with longer formats. Sometimes you're just not in the mood to invest the next couple of months to a 5-book series, but need your fantasy fix. Yeah, that goes back to pretty much what we were saying before. Standalone fantasy seems to be a great palette cleanser, and it's great as an introductory story format for people who might be new to the genre. I like standalones or trilogies, but once we get into a 4+ book series, I get really bogged down. It's hard to want to read something and then be told, oh, it has 10+ books in it. I think this is a great one to leave for last because we did kind of talk about it just a moment ago, but also I think it brings it back to the biggest plus for standalone fantasy, and that's commitment. Whether you're new or not, being asked a huge commitment for a popular fantasy series that you feel like you have to read to be part of the conversations within the fandom. For example, pretty much the whole Brandon Sanderson, like, just mania right now. He is arguably the most relevant fantasy author right now by a long stretch. But if you want to be part of the conversations around him and his works, you have a lot of reading to do. It took me a really long time to get through Stormlight Archive, and I'm only just about to finish Era 1 in Mistborn, and they are great, but again, it's a huge commitment, and it is pretty disappointing that when it comes to fantasy, for all of the popular stuff, if you want to be part of the conversation, you have to make such a big commitment. So I guess my question is, could we see a rise in shorter storytelling within this genre? Standalone fantasy in particular. I think it would be awesome if we saw more popular fantasy standalones where everyone can just kind of read it and then talk about it and move on. More people want to be part of the conversation when it comes to the fantasy genre and fantasy books. It's a lot more difficult with longer series, so that is the value, in my opinion, of standalone fantasy. So there you have it. Should we bother with standalone fantasy fiction? Of course. I would say we should bother with it more than we have been thus far. I know there is a lot of popular standalone fantasy, especially nowadays. Actually, again, it is on the rise. But should we bother with it? Yes, I think we should bother with it more than we currently are. But how do you feel about standalone fantasy books? How do you feel about any of the stuff we've talked about in this video? Let me know in the comments. And hey, if you want more content around standalone fantasy, more discussion content, I would recommend Elliot Brooks's video on this very topic. Great video, great channel. I'll leave a link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. you're my favorite. I would love it if you subscribe to the channel for more fantasy book content and so that you can be involved in the next conversation. But I want to end this video on a question, the next possible topic for the next discussion video, and that is, what is your thoughts on romance in fantasy? Is romance in fantasy necessary? Have you found that it's usually done well, or do you think that it's usually done poorly? How do you think romance in fantasy has aged? Do you think it's aged well, or aged, again, poorly? Thanks again for watching. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya.